Hi, this is Mr. Grove, and we're going to start our unit on the nervous system. And as you can imagine, the nervous system is very complex, so we're going to break it up into several parts. And today we're going to look at part one, organization of the nervous system. And we're going to look at the two cells that make up nervous tissue. But don't forget to look at or read pages 226 to 235 in your textbook. You can find those in chapter 7. So let's get started. The nervous system really has three basic functions. Function number one is sensory. You have to imagine that your brain is literally locked up in a dark box. And so the only input it has is information coming from your eyes, coming from your ears, coming from all parts of your body. And so that's sensory input. That sensory input flows into your brain, and we go into step 2, which is called integration. In other words, you're just thinking about it. And once you think about all this sensory input, you have to act on it. And that is a motor response or motor output. So 3 steps. Got to gather information, number 1. You've got to think about it, process it, that's number 2, and then you got to respond to it. And homeostasis is listed here because when people think of responding in a motor fashion, they think of moving their arms, just like my graphic shows down below, or running or walking or moving the muscles in some way. But it's also staying the same, and the way you stay the same in homeostasis is by releasing hormones, glands are functioning, and you're processing enzymes. So a lot going on the motor side. Before we get too far along, look at couple of interesting facts about your neurons. They actually live and function for your complete lifetime. And that's a good thing because once you became a fetus, your neurons lost the ability to divide. Mitosis ended. So when you lose nerve cells, you lose nerve cells. The other thing that's really interesting is they got a tremendously high metabolic rate. They require a ton of oxygen. So even though the brain represents just 3% of your body weight, it's always using about 20% of your oxygen and energy supply at any given time. The picture below shows a little baby, and it says that try surprising a baby. If you've ever surprised a baby, walk in suddenly on them, drop a book, drop their bottle, you notice how they react. They don't just calmly turn their head and look at you. Instead, their whole body shakes, spasms almost uncontrollably. And that's because they're completely unmyelinated. And we're going to get into that more later. You remember from our study of histology that neurons are insulated. Many of them are insulated with myelin, Schwann cells. Babies don't have any of these, and so they don't have any fine motor control yet. First thing we want to look at is the organization of the nervous system, because if you don't understand the big picture, it makes it really hard to understand the minutiae when we really get into it. The nervous system, as you can see, is divided into 2 parts. Central nervous system, with the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which is going to make up our nerves. Now, it's easy to remember these because the brain and spinal cord are virtually in the center of the body, hence central nervous system. On the other hand, think of your toes and fingers as being about as far away from the center of your body as you can get. In other words, they're on the periphery, so we call it the peripheral nervous system. Now, going back to the central nervous system is, kind of where it's all at. This is your thoughts, your memories, your desires, all the goals you've set yourself for the rest of your lifetime. In essence, this is you. So this is your brain and your spinal cord. So the brain processes, looks at its reality, creates its own reality in many ways, and then has to send those signals so that you can interact with your outside world, and it sends them through the spinal cord. And the spinal cord, being also in the center of the body, makes up the central nervous system. But the spinal cord is made up of nerves. So when you want to send a signal, you send it via the PNS, or peripheral nervous system, via the nerves. And it turns out there's 2 kinds of nerves. You have motor nerves and you have sensory nerves. And we've kind of already talked about that with the three parts of the nervous system. So the sensory side of your body is getting information from two places. It's getting information from your somatic sensory. Somatic means body. So think of your fingers, think of you stepping on a tack, think of you watching TV or listening to music. That's the somatic side. And then you have the visceral side, what's going on inside your body. So stuff happening in your intestines, and other body systems being sent up the sensory neurons to the central nervous system. Now, when your central nervous system decides to act on whatever it's getting, it's going to send the signal down the nerves to motor neurons. And remember, motor neurons most people think of as just going to the body, hence somatic. These would be your muscles. So this would make your fingers contract or your leg muscles contract. But you also have an autonomic side, and this is the involuntary side, the side you don't even have to consciously think about. Think of your heart beating, speeding up, slowing down, blood pressure changing, respiratory rate moving, your food being sent through your digestive system. All that is happening autonomically, as opposed to the somatic side where it's completely voluntary. Now, going back to the autonomic side, you also have two places here. So you're controlling sympathetic nerves, and think of sympathetic as fight or flight. So anything that gets you all excited and worked up, that's the sympathetic being stimulated. And then the parasympathetic, they always teach you in anatomy classes, rest and digest. So things tend to calm down on this side. So there you go. There's the big picture of how our nervous system is organized. Let's get into a little fine detail. Nervous tissue, as you remember from way back in the first quarter when we did the microscope and histology, is really just composed of two cells. Cell number 1 being the functional unit, or the neuron. And we're going to discuss all these different parts here in just a few seconds. But let's take a look at cell number 2. Cell number 2 is the neuroglia. The neuroglia, and there are like 5 different neuroglia cells, and they're supporting cells. And that sounds like they don't have much of a role, but they do. You guys will remember that they're incredibly numerous, far more numerous than the neurons, and the neurons themselves couldn't even function without them. So in a few moments, we'll look at the 5 different neuroglia cells. Well, let's go to the neuron, because we're really familiar with this already, having done our study in histology. But part 2 looks at how a neuron actually creates a thought or an action potential. So we do have to review the anatomy of the neuron. And you'll remember that there's a cell body, the enlarged part of the neuron, so that's right here, and that contains all the organelles, including the nucleus. Number 2 is the dendrites. These are these little spiny structures located on the outside, and they receive impulses from the world, from other neurons, and pass them down from the cell body via the axon being that long filament. So number 3 is the axon. And it's also interesting that in the brain, the axons are incredibly tiny. You got to make room for billions and billions of neurons. But in the peripheral nervous system, these axons can be as long as 1 meter in length. So running all the way from the base of your spinal cord into your foot. And number 4 are the axon terminals. And do you remember the significance of the axon terminals? They contain the neurotransmitters that are going to allow us to conduct our action potential to another neuron or to another effector unit, or such as a muscle. So there's the anatomy of a neuron. There are 3 types of neurons. Again, we had this back when we were doing our study on cells, but we want to remind ourselves that the 3 types are sensory neurons, or afferent, which means they move impulses from sensors like your ears and your eyes to the central nervous system. There are interneurons, or association neurons, where you process this signal and think about it and then send them down via motor or efferent neurons, which move impulses to your muscles or your glands. I like my little graphic here that I found. Motor neuron with his motor. These are sensory neurons down here. Okay, so this is free nerve endings. This would be a pain neuron. So if you step on a pin, touches one of these, this type of neuron right here is a pressure neuron. You have those in your fingers and skin for touching things. And over on this graphic, we're looking at an interneuron found in your spinal cord because of what are called reflex arcs, which we'll again talk about later. Your spinal cord can do some thinking for you, and the reason it can do that is to have you react quickly. So when you touch a hot stove and that signal's being sent up this afferent or sensory neuron, you don't want to take the time for the signal to get all the way to your brain and your brain say, "Whoa, the stove's hot, move my hand, move my hand." Instead, the interneuron or thinking neuron found inside your spinal cord can make that thought for you and send the signal quickly down the efferent neuron, and you lift your hand up with hopefully minimal damage from touching the hot stove. So there's your three types of neurons. The neuroglia have 5 main types. And number 1 are the Schwann cells, which forms the myelin sheath that's found, the white matter that's found in the PNS or peripheral nervous system. The oligodendrocytes, which also can form Schwann cells or myelin sheath, but primarily in the central nervous system. The microglia, which they attack any foreign material that tries to get and attack your neurons. The astrocytes, which connect blood vessels to your neurons, in the ependymal cells, which create the membranes that tend to line the brain structures. So there's the 5 neuroglia. And lastly, we'll take just a quick glance at white versus gray matter. You hear all the time that, hey, somebody who is smart has a lot of gray matter. Essentially what that means is that the gray matter is unmyelinated. Okay, so those axons do not have any myelin around them and tend to look gray in a gross section. This is a section of the brain, cut the brain through the head along this plane right here. And then you have the white matter, which is the myelinated axons, which so much predominate in your peripheral nervous system. Okay, well that's it for part 1. And this is Mr. Grove signing off.